The loft smelled like fresh sawdust and August heat, and the sweat of 40 men who had raised 4 walls in a single day. I remember standing at the bottom of the ladder looking up and thinking, someone left a lantern burning up there. A warm orange glow against the darkening sky outside the new window openings. The wood still pale and clean the way wood only looks before weather gets to it, before it darkens and settles and becomes part of the land around it. And then I heard my name. Not called loudly, not in front of anyone. Just spoken, low and certain, the way a man speaks when he has already decided something and is only now informing you of it. My name is Martha, and I grew up Old Order Amish in a small district in eastern Ohio. I left 12 years ago, and this channel is where I say the things that were never permitted to be said out loud. If you have ever wondered what happens inside a plain community when the workday ends and the visitors go home, stay with me. Subscribe and leave me a comment below. Tell me if you have ever been to a barn raising, or if you only know the word. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to that August. I was 22 years old, married 14 months, and the barn raising had been the largest event our district had hosted in years. It was for the Yoder family. Jonas Yoder, who had lost his old barn to a fire the previous spring, a fire that started in the hay and took the whole structure before dawn. In our community, when something like that happens, you do not grieve long. You plan. Within 6 weeks, the lumber had been sourced and milled and stacked. The women had begun organizing food. A date was set. 3 neighboring church districts came, close to 60 men on the frame by mid-morning. Women in the farmhouse kitchen from 4 in the morning, cooking enough food to feed a small town. Roast chicken, noodles with browned butter, pies in stacks of 6 on the counter, potato salad in the largest bowls I had ever seen used outside of a wedding. The kind of cooking that requires a kind of coordination most people have never witnessed. No lists, no assignments written down. Just women who had done this together before and knew without speaking who would handle what. I had been on my feet since before the sun came up. By the time the frame was standing, by the time the last peg was driven and the men came down from the beams and the bishop said a short prayer of thanksgiving over the new structure. It was nearly dark. The children were already falling asleep in the grass, the littlest ones carried by older sisters with the practiced ease of girls who have been tending children since they could walk themselves. Babies passed between arms. The older women were washing the last of the dishes by lamplight, talking quietly, the way women talk when the work is almost done, and the men are no longer watching. And my husband came to find me at the kitchen door. He did not say much. He rarely did. He was not a hard man, I want to be careful to say that. He was a quiet man, contained. The kind of man who expressed things not in words, but in presence. Standing close, a hand at the small of my back, a look that carried more than a sentence. Other women in the community spoke of their husbands as good men, or difficult men, or funny men. When women asked me about mine, I always said, he is steady, and he is mine. And both of those things felt, at 22, like enough. He said, come see the loft before everyone leaves. I want to show you the view from up there. And I went, because that is what you did. Because the community was still all around us, and there was nothing alarming in the words themselves. Because I was 22 years old, and I had learned very early that certain invitations from a husband were not questions. They were announcements. And the appropriate response to an announcement was to follow. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something that took me years to fully understand. In my community, barn raisings were not simply about building a structure. They were loaded events in ways that outsiders rarely understood. A barn raising was the most visible display of community unity, a demonstration of what the Ordnung, our unwritten code, produced when it was working as intended. 60 men working in coordinated silence, no argument, no competition, no foreman barking orders. The whole thing accomplished through submission to a shared purpose, through a kind of collective obedience that was, in our theology, itself an act of worship. The bishop would say, See how the body works when each part submits to the whole. He was talking about the barn, he was talking about everything. But underneath that unity was a current that ran in a specific direction. The men had performed. They had shown strength, skill, stamina, sacrifice. A full day of physical labor in the service of a neighbor, a brother, a fellow member of the body. Bodies that ached by midday and kept going anyway. Men who drove pegs with their hands bleeding from small cuts and did not stop. That kind of labor, in our theology, carried weight. It built something not only in the field, but in the man himself. And what is built in a man, in our tradition, is owed certain acknowledgement. This is not something anyone said explicitly. It was not in the Ordnung. It was not preached from the bench on a Sunday morning. It was simply understood, the way so many things in Amish life are understood. Not spoken, not written, just transmitted. Through atmosphere, through the look that passed between older women when a young wife's husband had worked particularly hard that day and came to claim her early from the kitchen. Through the way a mother-in-law might press a young wife's hand on the morning after a barn raising and say nothing at all, the pressing itself the message. Through the quiet permission granted to men on evenings after communal labor. Permission that no one granted officially because it did not need to be granted. It simply existed, the way gravity exists, unnamed and absolute. I have since spoken to women from other districts in Indiana, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin. The specifics of their stories are all different. The language is always slightly different. But the understanding is always the same. A barn raising is a claiming day. What the husband claims varies. When he claims it, and where, that is between him and the walls of whatever building happens to still be standing. I was already up the ladder when I understood this was not about the view. The loft was half finished. Raw beams overhead, the smell of fresh pine still sharp enough to catch in the throat. The floor not yet planked completely, wide gaps between the boards, the ground visible below in places if you looked down, which I tried not to. The lantern was hanging from a peg someone had hammered into an upright post earlier in the day. The hay that would eventually fill this space was still out in the field. It smelled clean, new, like something that had not yet become what it was going to be. He was already there when I reached the top of the ladder. He had taken off his hat. That is the detail I remember most clearly, which probably sounds strange. A hat. But in our world, a man removing his hat in an indoor space at the end of a workday carried a particular signal. It was not dramatic. There was no ceremony to it. It was quiet and deliberate. The way everything about him was quiet and deliberate. A small action that meant something large. He looked at me. And I felt the thing I had felt on our wedding night. That particular mixture of knowing and not knowing. Of being chosen and being claimed, and those two things feeling like the same thing. And also, in some way I could not have articulated then. Like very different things at the same time. Here is what nobody tells you about Amish womanhood in those early years of marriage. You are not taught that your body belongs to you. That concept, bodily autonomy, as my therapist would teach me to call it years later, was not part of my formation. My formation was, a wife yields, a wife submits. The language in our wedding ceremony was not symbolic or poetic. Galassheit, yielding. It was not aspiration. It was description. It told you what you were and what you were for. And it did this in front of everyone you had ever loved, and everyone nodded because this was right, and this was the covenant, and this was the life. And so, in that loft, in the heat that was still trapped under the new roof from the long August day, with the sound of the community slowly dispersing below us, buggies being readied, voices calling goodnight across the yard, children crying with exhaustion, I did not think to question the invitation that had brought me up the ladder. I thought, this is what marriage is. I thought, the day was long and he worked hard, and this is what it means to be a wife who honors that. I thought, no one can see us, and we are married, so there is no sin here. There is nothing here but what is supposed to be here. What I did not think What I had not yet been given the language to think was, do I want this? Here, now. In this particular place on this particular evening, after this particular long and exhausting day when my feet ache and my hands smell like dish soap, and I have been cooking since before the sun rose. That question did not exist for me yet. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is what came after. I climbed back down the ladder when it was fully dark. The community was nearly gone. Buggies pulling out of the lane, lanterns bobbing through the field toward the road like slow fireflies. The farmhouse windows were yellow and warm. Someone had left a plate of food wrapped in a cloth on the porch step for us. Chicken and bread and a wedge of pie, left without a note because no note was needed. I carried that plate into the house, and I set it on the table, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time before I lit the lamp. I was not in pain. Not the way I had been in the early months of marriage, before I learned what my neighbor's jar of olive oil was for, before I understood that suffering was not the only available condition. I was not injured. I was not, by any definition my community would have accepted, wronged. But I felt something I could not name. I have spent years in therapy trying to find the right word for it, and the closest I have come is this: erasure, not violence, not cruelty. Something quieter and more complete than either of those. The feeling of having been present, and also somehow absent from the same event. Of having been there in the body while something else, some essential part of what makes a person, had simply not been consulted. And the most devastating part, the part I keep returning to, is that he was not cruel. He was gentle even, in his particular contained way. He was not a man who enjoyed causing pain. He believed, fully and without question, in the same theology that had formed me. He believed that what had happened in that loft was natural and right, and an expression of something sacred between a husband and a wife, after a day of communal labor and communal worship. He believed it because he had never been given any reason not to. That is the thing I have had to sit with the longest. The men in my community were not taught to be predators. They were taught to be heads of household. They were taught that a wife's yielding was her highest spiritual expression. They were taught that claiming what was theirs was not something to be apologized for. It was something to be received by the wife as she would receive any other rightful thing, the way a field receives rain, gratefully and without resistance. The woman who suffers quietly is faithful. The man who leads decisively is godly. And the two of them together performing those roles in the dark are simply a plain family doing what plain families do, century after century, district after district, in every barn and bedroom and loft from Ohio to Pennsylvania to Indiana. The system does not require anyone to be a villain. That is what makes it so complete. My friend Rebecca married into a neighboring district the same spring I married. She told me once. We were shelling peas on her back porch, voices low even though no one was within a quarter mile, because you lower your voice for certain conversations regardless of who might hear. She told me that on the evening of her first barn raising as a wife, she had felt proud, genuinely proud. Her husband had worked from before sunrise. He had been on the highest beam. The men below had called up to him and he had answered without looking down, and she had watched him from the yard and felt something she described as almost fierce. He is mine, she had thought. That man up there is mine. And when he came to find her at the end of the day and led her away from the other women with his hand at her back, she felt, she used this word and I will not change it, honored. I believed her completely. That was her true experience, and I have no reason to question it. But she also told me, peas going into the bowl, eyes down, not looking at me, that by their third barn raising, the pride had flattened into something more like resignation. Not because he had changed. He was the same man, the same hand at her back, the same quiet leading away from the group. Because she had started to notice the pattern, the way the day's labor seemed to function as a currency, something accumulated through work and sacrifice and then, at day's end, collected. From her. Without her being asked whether she had anything left to give, she said, "I never stopped him, Martha. I never said no. I do not know if I would have been allowed to. I never found out. I never even thought to find out. That is what I have had to live with." We sat with that for a long time, the two of us, with the bowl of peas between us and the afternoon getting long and the light going golden over the fields. This is what silence produces. Not understanding, not even conscious harm in most cases. Just generation after generation of women sitting in afternoon light with bowls of peas, not saying the thing, passing the not saying on to the next woman, and the next and the next. The silence itself becoming the inheritance. The silence itself becoming the ordnung that nobody wrote down. I left my community when I was 29 years old. The shunning was immediate, as it always is. Phone calls unanswered. A letter to my mother that came back to me still sealed, my own handwriting on the outside looking unfamiliar to me, like something from a different person's life, which I suppose it was. My younger sisters who had known me every day of their lives looked past me in a parking lot 2 months after I left, not with cruelty, with grief that had been converted, the way our tradition converts everything, into obedience. In the years since, I have sat in a therapist's office in an ordinary room in an ordinary building, and I have learned words that were never spoken in my parents' house. Consent, autonomy, bodily integrity, the right to be present in your own body as a person rather than as a vessel for something larger. I have learned that those words are not English words for worldly or sinful concepts. They are simply words for things that are true about human beings. Things that were true about me even when I was 22 years old, standing at the bottom of a ladder in a new barn in the August heat, too young and too thoroughly formed to know what question I was not yet permitted to ask. I do not tell this story with bitterness toward my husband. He is still there, in that district, still farming the same land. I think of him without the anger I once felt in those early years of therapy, when the anger was necessary and right, and the only honest response I had. I think of him now as a man who was also failed, who was handed a theology that told him his authority was sacred, and his wife's submission was her gift, and that the two of those things fitting together required no further examination. He never examined them. I do not believe he had the tools to. The tools had been removed from his formation the same way they had been removed from mine. I do not tell this story to condemn the Amish. I carry that community in me still, the sound of the bishop's voice in the long morning services, the smell of bread in a kitchen before sunrise, the feeling of 40 voices singing the old slow hymns together in a room without instruments, just human breath and human sound. That belongs to me and I will not surrender it. But belonging to a community and telling the truth about it are not opposing things. They can exist in the same person. In fact, the person who was formed by a community may be the only one who can tell certain truths about it faithfully. Not from the outside, where it is easy to condemn, but from the inside, where it is complicated and costly and real. The girl who climbed that ladder at 22 deserved to know that she had a self, not a role, not a function, a self, with its own perceptions and its own exhaustion and its own right to be asked. The desire to be asked, not merely expected, was not pride, was not hogmutt, was not a failure of faith or submission or wifely devotion. It was just human. The most ordinary and sacred wish in the world, to be seen as a person before you are seen as anything else. If you grew up in a tradition where your body was described as belonging to something larger than yourself, to God, to your husband, to the community, to the covenant, I see you. If you were taught that yielding and consent were the same word for the same thing, I see you. If you have ever stood in your own kitchen in the dark after a long communal day and felt something you had no name for and no permission to name, I see you. You were not wrong for feeling it. You were not faithless. You were not weak. You were living inside a language that had removed certain words on purpose, because certain words, once learned, open doors that cannot be closed again. Those words belong to you now. They always did. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.